The scent of rosemary and ruin was the first thing to greet me. It clung to the worn wool of my coat, a final fragrant ghost from my mother's garden, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the hospital I'd just left. I stood at the foot of the gravel drive, staring up at the house on Hemlock Lane. It was less a home and more a memory I'd tried to forget, a looming Victorian skeleton whose windows watched my approach with a vacant, weary malice. I hadn't set foot here in 15 years, not since the screaming match with my father that finally gave me the courage to flee this gilded cage of silence and secrets. The lawyer's voice on the phone had been a dry, crisp thing. "The estate is straightforward, Ms. Vance. The house and its contents are yours. There is, however, a specific stipulation in the will. You must physically reside in the house for 30 consecutive days to fully inherit. No overnight absences. Otherwise, the property and a separate, significant financial trust will be automatically relinquished to a secondary beneficiary." He had paused and I could almost hear his distaste through the line. "The will does not specify who that is." That mystery was a barbed hook, and I, with my city life recently imploded, a layoff notice and a fiancé who decided he preferred a less complicated partner, was adrift and desperate enough to be caught. The key, heavy and cold, felt like a betrayal in my hand. It turned in the front door's lock with a groan that seemed to originate from the very foundations of the place. Pushing the door open was like breaking a seal on a tomb. The air inside was thick, motionless, and heavy with the cloying ghost of my mother's signature jasmine perfume and the profound dust of abandoned years. It was a museum of my unhappy childhood, every ugly vase and worn rug exactly as I remembered, yet it felt utterly alien and hostile. To my left, in the formal parlor, the grand piano was a silent, sheet-draped monolith. I remembered my mother's slender hands dancing across those keys, creating beauty in a house that had none. Now it was just another piece of furniture waiting for the axe. The eyes of my stern ancestors, captured in oil paintings along the dark hallway, seemed to track my slow, hesitant progress from their gilded frames. And then, a movement in the shadows of the foyer resolved into a man. My older brother stood there, a cold, polished shock in the decaying grandeur. He looked like a portrait of our father had stepped out of its frame. The same sharp suit, the same calculating gaze, just a newer, more expensive model. Elara. My name was a statement, not a greeting. I wondered if you'd actually come crawling back. His smile was a thin, bloodless line. "I assume you've heard the quaint terms of Mother's final joke. A foolish sentimentality. This place is a teardown. The land is what's valuable. Be smart. Sign your rights over to me now and I'll give you a fair cash sum. More than fair. You can walk away today and forget this miserable place ever existed." My fingers tightened into a white-knuckled fist around the strap of my duffel bag. The familiarity of his condescension was like a spark on dry tinder. "I'm staying, Liam." His smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something dark and impatient. "Sentimental to the last. You never could see the practicalities. You always let your emotions cloud your judgment." He didn't say goodbye, simply turned and walked out, leaving the front door open, a rectangle of gray, indifferent light cutting across the dusty floor. That first night the house came alive. It was not a welcoming aliveness, but a symphony of protest, a building expressing its displeasure at my presence. Floorboards creaked with the weight of unseen footsteps pacing the hallway outside my door. The wind outside, which had been still, suddenly picked up and whistled a mournful, discordant tune through a cracked pane in the attic I hadn't yet discovered. And from within the walls, a faint, rhythmic scratching began, a persistent, skittering sound. Like a mouse trapped in the plaster, I told myself, desperate for a rational anchor. Or like fingernails. I pulled the covers over my head, the child I once was resurfacing in the face of the unknown, and told myself it was the old plumbing, the natural settling of a century-old structure. I almost believed it. On the third day, rootling through the detritus of my mother's life in the sewing room for some shred of comfort, some posthumous forgiveness, I found it. Tucked inside her old maple sewing box, beneath a tangle of faded thread and a dried-up pincushion that still smelled faintly of her, was a small brass key. It was tarnished almost black with age, cool and heavy for its size. It felt significant. It didn't fit any lock I could find, not the roll-top desk in the study, not the china cabinet in the dining room, not the old steamer trunks gathering spiderwebs in the attic. It was a question without an answer, a secret she had left behind for me and me alone. Liam called daily, his offers becoming less generous, his tone shifting from condescension to bald insistence. "You don't belong there, Elara," he said during his last call, his voice low and deliberate. "This house, it doesn't want you here. It has a way of punishing those who don't belong." It was the closest he'd come to a direct threat. The scratching in the walls grew louder each night, a persistent, nagging counterpoint to my growing insomnia. It seemed to be concentrated in my old childhood bedroom, emanating most strongly from the wall behind the headboard. The wall behind which, I remembered with a sudden chill, was a narrow, disused servant's staircase that had been sealed off decades before I was born. One sleepless night, the moon full and bright through my window, driven by a compulsion I didn't understand, I got out of bed and pressed my ear directly to the faded floral wallpaper. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed was somehow louder, more menacing. I held my breath. And for a single heart-stopping moment I heard it, a soft, ragged whisper so faint it might have been the wind coaxing a draft through the house, but it formed a single, clear, unmistakable syllable. My name. Elara. But the whisper wasn't the only secret the walls held. The real horror was what I found hidden behind them. That whisper, my name spoken by the silence itself, coiled deep inside my ear, a ghostly echo that shattered any last pretense of rational explanation. This was not my imagination. The house was not just old. It was conscious, and it was trying to tell me something. Liam's next visit was less a negotiation and more an inspection. He walked through the rooms with a clinical detachment, making notes on his phone, his eyes seeing only square footage and demolition costs. He paused in the parlor, his gaze lingering on the draped piano. "Sentimental junk," he muttered under his breath, but I didn't miss the slight tremor in his hand as he reached out to adjust the dust cover. He was afraid of this room. "Why is the piano so important, Liam?" I asked, my voice cutting through the thick silence. He flinched, a barely perceptible twitch, but it was a crack in his polished armor. "It isn't. Nothing in this mausoleum is important except the land it sits on." He left soon after, but his parting words were a deliberate, cold warning. 30 days is a long time, little sister. A lot can happen in an old house like this. Be careful. This house has secrets. Not all of them are pleasant. His fear was my catalyst. He knew something. The key, the whisper, the piano, Liam's strange anxiety. They were all threads of the same tangled web, and I was finally ready to start pulling. I returned to my bedroom, to the wall where I had heard the whisper. I ran my hands over the faded roses and vines of the wallpaper, pressing, searching for a seam, a weakness, anything. In the very corner, behind my heavy oak dresser, my fingers found a slight give. With a grunt of effort, I shoved the cumbersome furniture aside, its legs screeching in protest against the wooden floor. The wallpaper here was slightly different, a patch job done with less care and an older pattern. Using the tip of the brass key, I scored a ragged line down the middle and carefully peeled the paper back. Beneath was not plaster but old, dry-rotted wood paneling. And in the center of the paneling was a small, tarnished keyhole. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. The brass key slid in perfectly, a satisfying click in the quiet room. With a gritty, reluctant turn, the lock released. The small panel swung inward on stiff hinges, revealing not a staircase but a dark, shallow space, a hidey hole. The air that wafted out was several degrees colder than the room and carried the faint, unmistakable and now chilling scent of rosemary. Inside was a single object, a small lacquered box. I carried it to my bed as if it were a holy relic, my hands trembling not from weakness but from a terrifying anticipation. The box contained no jewels, no stacks of money. Instead, I found a bundle of aged letters tied with a faded ribbon, a small tarnished silver rattle, and a single sepia-toned photograph I had never seen before. It showed my mother, young and radiant, sitting in this very house, holding 2 newborn infants wrapped in identical blankets. But the mother in the photo was not smiling down at them. She was looking directly at the camera, her expression one of profound, heartbreaking sorrow. And written on the back, in her elegant, familiar script, were 3 words that stopped my breath and rewrote my history in an instant. My lost daughters. Daughters. Plural. The word echoed in the silent room, a seismic shock that reshaped the very bedrock of my past. The infant always pictured in Liam's arms in all the official family photos. It hadn't been Liam. I had a twin sister. We were the lost daughters. The letters, brittle with age and sorrow, were from my grandmother to my mother. They spoke of a shame too great to bear, a secret that had to be buried for the family's reputation. You cannot keep them both, one letter read, its script frantic. The town, your future, your sanity, it will not allow it. The choice is a terrible one, but it must be made. The one you send away must never be spoken of again. It is the only way. The secondary beneficiary in the will, it wasn't Liam. It was her. My sister. The lost daughter. The Rosemary house wasn't just an inheritance. It was a crime scene, and my mother's final, desperate wish was for me to uncover the truth and make it right. The whispers, the scratching, it wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a memory, the house's own aching memory of the child who was taken, the sister who was erased from our family's story. Liam knew. He had always known. That was the true source of his fear, his desperation to demolish the house and bury its secret forever under concrete and sod. I confronted him in the driveway as he was getting into his car, the photograph held out like a shield. The color drained from his face, all his polished composure evaporating into the humid air. Who was she, Liam? What did you and our parents do? For a long moment he just stared at the image of our mother and her two babies, then his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. Her name was Rose, he whispered, his voice ragged with a guilt he'd carried for decades. Mother was unstable after the birth. The doctor said she couldn't handle twins. The noise, the chaos. Father made a private deal with a wealthy, childless cousin from out of state. They took Rose the day they left the hospital. We were never to speak of it. It was for the best. For whose best? I shot back, my voice trembling with a fury that had been building for a lifetime I hadn't known was a lie. You were going to let me sign away her inheritance. You were going to bury her all over again. But the truth I uncovered was more devastating than a stolen inheritance. My family's secret was a living, breathing person who'd been waiting for me all along. That night after Liam's confession, I went to the sealed-off servants' staircase, the true source of the whispers. I didn't hear them anymore. Instead, I felt a profound, settling peace, as if the house itself had finally exhaled, its long vigil nearly over. The restless energy that had plagued my first weeks was gone, replaced by a solemn quiet. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I hired a private investigator, using the last of my savings as a down payment. I gave him the little I had, the name Rose, the date of my birth, and the vague notion of a private adoption. It felt like searching for a needle in a haystack, a ghost in the machine of bureaucracy and sealed records. But I had to try. The 30-day clock was ticking, but its meaning had transformed. It was no longer a countdown to an inheritance. It was a race to find my sister before Liam could find a way to legally block me, or before I lost my nerve and the house claimed my sanity for good. The investigator was a quiet, efficient man who asked few questions. For 2 agonizing weeks I heard nothing. I paced the dusty rooms, the silence now feeling expectant rather than oppressive. I cleaned the parlor, uncovering the piano, its dark wood gleaming under a layer of polish. I didn't play, I couldn't, but I sat before it, feeling a connection to my mother I hadn't felt in years. Then the call came. I found her. His voice was calm, but the words sent a jolt through me. Her name is Clara now. She lives 3 towns over. She's a gardener. A gardener. Of course she was. The Rosemary. He gave me an address. The drive, there was a blur of tangled nerves and desperate hope. What would I even say? Hello, I'm the sister you never knew you had, the one our family gave away? I parked down the street from a small, well-kept cottage surrounded by a lush, vibrant garden. And then I saw her. She was on her knees, digging in the soil, her hair tied back in a messy bun. She looked up as I approached, and I saw my own eyes staring back at me from a face that was both foreign and intimately familiar. She had our mother's smile lines around her eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice warm but cautious. I couldn't speak. I just held out the sepia photograph. Her eyes dropped to it and her face went pale. She looked from the photo to my face, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning, staggering comprehension. The reunion was not dramatic but quiet, a slow and painful knitting together of 2 souls that had been torn apart at the root. We sat on her porch for hours, talking, crying, piecing together the fragments of our broken history. We met the next day in the parlor of the Rosemary house, and for the first time, the building felt not haunted but hallowed, a sanctuary finally fulfilling its purpose. On the 30th day, Clara and I stood together on the wide front porch, watching as Liam's car disappeared down Hemlock Lane for the last time, his claims legally nullified by the evidence of the will and our testimony. The house, and the substantial trust that came with it, now belonged to both daughters, as it always should have. The truth we realized was our real inheritance. We decided not to sell but to restore the old house, to fill its silent, sorrowful rooms with new life, music, and the shared history we were only just beginning to build. As we turned to go back inside, Clara paused, her hand resting on the doorframe as if feeling a heartbeat within the wood. "I always felt a pull to this place," she said softly, her voice full of wonder. "Like a thread tied to my heart, tugging me here." I nodded, finally understanding the relentless, unexplained call that had drawn me home from the city. The mystery of the Rosemary house was solved, but its true purpose, as a home for a reunited family, was only just beginning. I looked at my sister, a living, breathing piece of my soul returned to me, and finally understood the haunting truth. My mother didn't leave me a house, she left me a sister and a secret I was never meant to find.